Is there a gap between what believers, Christians, think they believe about God, they're thinking about God, and their understanding of missions? Because it seems to me there is, for many Christians, for many followers of Jesus, there is a separation between their understanding of God, their theology, and their understanding of missions or God's mission. And at worst, it's not just separate from, they think there is a conflict between them. And from my perspective, it is this perceived idea that theology is over here and missions is over here that is hindering the church from completing and playing its role in God's worldwide conquest through the Great Commission. And that's what we want to talk about today. So let's get into it. I feel like many times in churches, you have the theology camp over here and you have the missions camp over here, and they never meet. In fact, many times they're butting heads. And so you have theology, which is, I define it as, that is learning about and your understanding of who God is, of understanding God. And you have missions, which is learning about and your understanding of God's mission. And somehow we have decided those are separate. But it seems to me, if you have your understanding of God, and this is God's mission here, that these two should be interconnected. In other words, when you're talking about the theology of God, the missions is there with it. And when you're talking about the mission of God, it is there with the theology of God. And so that's what I want to get into. And it leads to this statement that all missions must be theology-based, and all theology must be missions-focused. And I want to say that again because we're going to dig into both parts of that. All missions must be theology-based, and all theology must be missions-focused. So let's get into the first part. All missions must be theology-based. Let's do the first sentence first. Okay. I don't understand how you can say you are going out to complete God's worldwide conquest, his mission, which is what we call the Great Commission, if you don't know who God is. How can you go out to complete the mission of God that when you don't know God, you don't know who he is, you don't know what he's about? So for me, missions has to always be theology based. In other words, missions always has to come from an understanding of who God is, this God is that we are going out on missions for. Because how can you go out and say you're doing missions, which is going out, telling the world, telling people about what? Who God is, what he's done, what he's doing, about his salvation, about his kingdom, about his community of people on this earth, church, and what it means to be living life in the kingdom of God on this earth. How can you tell people about this if you don't know God, if you don't have an understanding of God that is in line with who the God of the Bible is? Theology, right? So I don't think there's any doubt that all missions must be theology based. I think probably when you really got down to it, most people would agree with that statement. I think here is where the biggest issue is within the church that we can work on and help, is that all theology must be missions focused. And I feel this is where, and I know I used to do this for the longest time until it was made aware to me that I was doing that. I would be teaching people, and I would be teaching people about God, but it was never linked into God's mission. It was just, here, we're going to learn all this information about God. We're going to learn all this information about Jesus, right? But I was never linking it to God's mission or his heart, as I like to call it. So all theology must be missions focused, because once we come to understand who God is, what we find out is that God is a missionary God. And God's end game is that there will be people from every ethnic group of people on this earth around the throne in heaven, worshiping him forever and ever, so that his name is being made great and his salvation is being made known, not just to people on this earth, but both to the seen world, which we see, and to the unseen world. Okay? Part of the purpose of the church is to reveal God's greatness to the unseen world through his salvation of changing people from being dead to being alive. And we as the church are his voice, his mission agencies, his missionaries, his ambassadors to go out and tell the world, all groups of people in the world, about this. So for me, all theology must be missions focused. It has to be, because at the center of God's heart is his name being made great and his salvation being known amongst all groups of people on this earth, so that he will be made great and he will be known, and his wonderfulness and who he is and his awesomeness will be known and seen, not just by people and things that we see in the physical world, but by those things that are in the world that we can't even see. And I find that so interesting. And I guess my point is, when theology and missions are not like this, being taught and shown to be together and always tied together, I think something is being dropped in our training and our teaching regarding theology and regarding missions. And I think that this separation of theology, the theology camp here, the missions camp here, and they don't come together, is a big reason why there are still 3 billion people in the world today who in all probability will be born, live, and die, never having an opportunity to hear the message and story of Jesus. In fact, 2,500 of those die every hour on average. 2,500, just think about that. That's slightly less than 1 every second. So every time I snap my fingers, another one has died. Just think about that. Okay? This is our mission as the church, because it is God's mission to reach these people. And we are not doing that very effectively, is my point. And I think a lot of it is because we have theology here, missions here, they don't come together. So this is what I want to challenge you to do, to try to help with that in your own life, and then maybe expand that into the life of your church just by sharing it with other people in your church and getting them to think about it. I'm not saying what to do about it, but can we at least get this on the table to begin thinking about it? So here's what I want you to do. What would the life of a follower of Jesus look like if they had the right connection, the right relationship between theology and mission, such that they are tied together and seen as one and not two separate entities? What would the life of a follower of Jesus, a Christian, a disciple of Jesus, an apprentice of Jesus look like if they had a right understanding of the relationship between theology and missions, and that they are closely tied together? And then what would that look like in a church who had that right understanding of theology and missions, and how they are intricately linked together and cannot be separated, that it is impossible to pull these apart? And then ask yourself, once you have an idea of what a person's life would look like that has that right understanding that all missions must be theology based and all theology must be missions focused, I think that's such a great summary that you can easily roll around in your head and continue to remind yourself. Once you understand what a life would look like that has that right relationship, evaluate your life and say, does your life look like that person that you just described? Does your life look like that? And then go expand it a little bit further and say, does the life of my church look like a church that has the right relationship between and connection between theology and the mission of God? And then here's what I want you to do as an individual. I want you to ask yourself, if those two are not lining up, what you understand a life would look like that had a right connection between missions and theology, and your life doesn't line up with that, what is your plan to begin moving toward a person who has those interconnected properly? Hey, if you like this and you found some value in this, how about liking it? Maybe even sharing it with somebody if you think it would help them. And finally, consider subscribing. If you found something beneficial in here, would love to have a comment down there. If you think I'm totally crazy and have no clue what I'm talking about, blast me in the comments also, because all the comments I read, I try to respond to, and it helps me make better content in the future that is more beneficial to people.